6 weeks ago, we were talking exclusively in our nation about corona. And we were talking about what's going on with this disease and this illness and how long is it going to last and what consequences are we going to have. We were talking about economy and jobs. And so I started a new series 4 weeks ago when it looked like things were starting to lighten up again as a nation. And I'm like, where do we go from here? And so that's the name of the series. And we started talking about what happens if corona comes back. We did a message on that. And how do we trust God no matter what storms come up in our life? And then we started talking about what are the lessons do you think God might want us to learn from what we've just experienced as a nation? And we did a whole message on that. And we've done these messages. And then over the last 4 weeks, though, our nation has changed again, right? The focus of our nation changed when George Floyd was murdered in the Twin Cities, and it changed. And the focus of our nation was no longer on corona, it was more on the race issue in America. And it has been dominating the news ever since then. And as this was going on, and we were watching riots and looting and protests and assaults and conversations about race in America, I really began to feel more and more compelled, like I need to speak about this issue. And I have never done it. 29 years of being a pastor, and I have never spoken on race. 29 years. It's probably way overdue, right? What really got me was, obviously, there are extreme views on race in America. Right? Isn't there, talk about extreme views in corona. Corona's a joke, corona's going to kill me, right? Everything in between. Well, what about race? Extreme views on race in America, even among Christians. There is extreme. The first church I pastored in Madison was one of the most racist groups I've ever even seen. I didn't know it existed. I never encountered it till I started pastoring a church in Madison, Wisconsin. Isn't that crazy? I remember one day this big retired blue-collar worker, he came up to me and he started just talking about, there was a low-income apartment building near ours, predominantly African-American, and he started saying all these racist things to me. I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. I was a young pastor. I'm like, I can't believe you're saying these words to me. You're a Christian. I'd never encountered it before. But it dominated that church that no longer even exists. Thank God it went under. It was the first time I'd really experienced it. I was not prepared for it. And as I listened over the last month to conversations about race, I knew and I felt compelled that it was time for me to address this subject. Past time for me. So let me show you something that really is in my mind as I'm starting this message. I'm going to bring you back to this verse later. The Bible says the righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. So by this definition in the Bible, which camp are you in? And I just want you to have that in the back of your mind, because most of us would think, well, I'm not wicked. I care about what's happening with the issues of poverty and injustice in America. Right? I doubt if any of you are sitting here going, I'm wicked. Right? Wicked. Right? You're not saying that. But the Bible, as you know, has so many verses about the issue of righteousness and justice. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of those who can't fight for themselves, the fatherless, the case of the widow. This is an important thing. So the question is what's happening in America today a situation where justice is required and Christians should be involved in justice? Should we view this as a justice issue? Because if we do, then God's word is so clear about it, right? If it is injustice, then it is the responsibility of everyone who says they follow Jesus to respond in some way to injustice. We don't get to choose apathy. Not if we follow Jesus. Justice is required. So before we go any further in this, we need to talk about what racism is. I heard someone brilliantly define it in 3 ways. Racism is 3 parts. It's hating a person because of their race. That exists today, right? They absolutely hate them because they are not white. Believing a race is inferior, super common. You are lesser because you're not white. Very common. But then the last one is the one that's really insidious and really hard to track. It's racial bias. It's prejudice. So you know what prejudice? Prejudice, pre means before, and justice is the idea of judging. So I'm prejudging you based on your skin color. And you're going to see, as we talk about this today, there is an enormous amount of prejudice in our country, where we prejudge you based on your skin color. You don't look like me, so I judge you before I even get to know you. So again, this is very common in America. And clearly right now, the African American community is really, really, really upset, right? I'm not overstating that. They are angry, and they're not going to take it anymore. And when I hear the conversations about what their behavior is, I felt like things are missing from the conversation that we need to talk about. So here, the simplest way I think to understand this is to ask you, what do you see? And I want you to go ahead and respond. What do you see? Empty bottle, okay. What else do you see? A&W, right? So you all see A&W? I don't see A&W, do I? I see contents with my glasses. I see nutritional information. Because I'm looking at it from this side, and you're looking at it from this side. And when I heard the discussions over the last few weeks, especially the lack of empathy, the lack of compassion, the lack of understanding from predominantly white people, one of the things that became clear to me in listening was, we just look at it like this. But they're not seeing that. They see this. Does that make sense? We look at the issue of race in America from a completely different perspective than they do. And that's very clear in our society. We don't look at it the same today. And because we don't understand their perspective, there's horrible conflict and pain. Look at this. The Bible says, my people are destroyed because of that lack of understanding. A lack of understanding creates conflict and pain. So I actually would not be doing this message except for one change in my life last year. Some of you know that I'm finishing my college degree. A mistake that I made so long ago, I am rectifying. Back in school full time, and I am finishing my degree, and almost all of what I had to finish were my gen eds. So last semester, I had 2 history requirements, so I finished this 550-page history book last semester, and I'm in my second history class right now, and I'm halfway through my 600-page history class, or book. So I have learned more about American history in the last 3 months than I ever knew, and every single chapter talks about, in our American history, the issue of race. And as I was going through history, the history of our country, I kept learning things that I had no idea actually happened. Things that they see very clearly, I never even knew. I never even knew, because it never happened to me or anyone I knew, so I only saw this side, and they have seen this side. So part of what I'm going to do today is a history lesson. So for those of you who love history, great day to come to church. Those of you who hate history, sorry, apologize, but it's kind of what I get to do today. Because I really hope that you understand more by the end of this. So let's start with our history. You know that the colonies were settled. Primarily the English people came here and they were settling this, they wanted to colonize America. And when they started colonizing, almost 2/3 of the English settlers came as what were called indentured servants. Do you remember that from somewhere in the back of your brain? Indentured servants? An indentured servant was someone in England, and they wanted to go to America to start a new life. At the time, there was tremendous poverty in England. There was overcrowding in England, and so they were happy to send them over here, but they couldn't afford the ticket and the passage. So what they would do is they would put ads out. This is an actual ad. They wanted farmers in Maryland. And you would become an indentured servant. You couldn't afford the ticket, so what they do is they pay for your ticket, and when you got here, you had to work for 5 to 7 years before you were set free. So you became a slave. You voluntarily enslaved yourself to come to America. And this is how the American colonies began. It was involuntary slavery. Now the problem was that if you did this, it sounds like a great deal, right? You're going to a new colony, you're going to go to a new country, you got a chance to start over after 5 to 7 years. There was hope that you'd be able to get farmland and you'd be a farmer and you could start your life. The problem was indentured slavery was a terrible, terrible bargain because many of them didn't survive the abuses of the 5 to 7 years. They died before they even made it. Even if they were set free 5 to 7 years later, they weren't given land in many cases. So what do you do then? You were subject to physical punishment. Did you know you could be bought and sold? I mean, it really was a slave situation, only the English were doing it to themselves. There was no European nation that embarked on colonizing America by using slave labor. It's not how they started. Especially since slaves were expensive. A true slave from Africa was very expensive because it was controlled by one shipping company, and they could charge whatever they want. When there's no competition, you charge what you want. So slaves were extremely expensive to buy. It was cheaper to use English people that you had enslaved. But then things started changing in the Chesapeake Valley of Virginia with the tobacco crop. I didn't know this. I thought slavery really began with cotton in America. Cotton wasn't the driving force. It was tobacco. But the problem was, there was such a high death rate among tobacco workers because the conditions were so terrible, and buying a slave from Africa was too expensive, so they just used English people to do it until those two factors changed. Competition opened up, and soon there were multiple people shipping slaves to America from Africa. And once competition opened up, the prices went down. And then you could afford to buy a human being. And then the differences were substantial, because now you owned them. You owned a human being till they died. On top of that, you owned their children. So you didn't just get someone for 5 to 7 years. Now you could buy a human being that you could keep forever till they died, and you'd own all their children automatically. And on top of that, if they got tired of your abuses and ran away, easier to find a black guy than to find a white guy. Right? Does that make sense? So all of a sudden, things started really changing in our nation's history when the price of a human being went down. So here's what we know. In 1680, in the Chesapeake Valley, there were only 5% of the population was African American. But look at by 1750, 70 years later. It's like they could not buy humans from Africa fast enough. Could not get them here fast enough. They just wanted to buy more and more humans. So then, as the population grew, all of a sudden fear grew, right? Because now there's more of them than us. So they put tremendously strict laws in place to control the African Americans. Slaves were property, completely subject to the will of their masters. They could be passed on to your descendants like you would pass on a cherished possession. They could be tried in courts, but only in separate courts. Blacks and whites were never tried together. No black could own a gun, could own a dog, could strike a white man for any reason, and if they were ever freed, they could never, ever, ever employ a white servant. An incredibly oppressive system designed to control these people. And of course, as demand went up, you remember probably from your history classes the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, where because they were so valuable in America, they would pack the ships completely full of human beings. They would be chained by their neck or their feet to the ship. Did you know that in some of these vessels, when they were packed this full, the distance between the decks was only 18 inches high? They'd slide them in there like cordwood, chain them to the deck with their neck or feet chained down. So narrow a space, they couldn't roll over, they couldn't sit on their side, they couldn't sit up. And 20% of all the slaves coming across the Atlantic died. 1/5. And this is what our ancestors, whites in America, did to blacks as the slave trade took off. Opposition started to slavery. It started in England, as far as I can see, with William Wilberforce, and I've mentioned him before. He was a Christian, a devout follower of Jesus who said, no more, no more. We English people are not going to tolerate this anymore. And so he began to, as a politician in England, fought for his entire career, first to get the slave trade ended, then to have a declaration that all slaves in every English colony around the world was set free. And what I read is on his deathbed, that was accomplished. Literally, he died shortly after being told, you've accomplished your goal. And England got out of the slave business. I love the quote. He said, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. And that's part of what I'm doing here today. After this message, you can choose what you do with the content. But you will never, ever stand in front of God and say, I didn't know. So just so you know what we're doing here today. In America, one of the greatest stories that we don't talk about enough is there was a group of Christians that escaped the persecution in England and came to Pennsylvania called the Quakers. And they believed that all races are equal in the eyes of God. A completely biblical worldview. And so they would not tolerate slavery in their midst among blacks or Native American Indians. an unheard of concept at this time. They welcomed all of them equally. Imagine if Quakers had been the dominant religion in North America at the time. It would have been a totally different world. Unfortunately, they weren't. Like I said, opposition began, especially in the North, as more and more laws were changed to try and limit slavery and its expansion in the colonies. Now, along came the Revolutionary War. Did you know that in our Revolutionary War and fighting for England, 5,000 slaves fought against the British? Did you know that? They helped us win our freedom. 5,000 was a lot of people in those armies at that time. Before the Revolutionary War, nearly every person who was black in America was a slave. But after the war, there began to spring up free communities. There are a lot of reasons for that. I don't have time to go into it, but look at this. 1776, less than 1,000 African Americans in the whole country were free. Afterwards, 1810, 200,000 were free now. So they started setting up their own communities. Did you know at that time, in every single state in the Union at the time, every single one except Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, blacks had the right to vote? I never knew that. But they did. They were free after the Revolutionary War, because obviously as a nation we're like, this is inconsistent for us to fight for our own freedom and enslave these people. And that view began to take root. And again, like I said, it was predominantly in the North. The South, they depended on the slaves in order to be able to be rich, because the slaves had to bring in their cotton and rice and tobacco, and if they weren't going to do that, they weren't going to be rich. And so they did not have the same view, because money trumps people and humanity. And it always has in our history of our world. Eventually, as you know, what happened then, it led to our own Civil War. And again, we know that the issue wasn't, if you remember your history class, you know you were taught the Civil War was fought about states' rights, right? Remember that? Wasn't fought about slavery. But the issue of states' rights was all about slavery. It was who gets to have slaves as new states, because we kept buying more and more land and purchasing land. We were expanding and starting new states, Missouri and Kansas and all these things. So which way will they come in? Will they come in as states that allow slavery, or come in as states that don't? Like Wisconsin, when we were admitted, we were not allowed slavery. And so the southern states could see where this was going, and they wanted new states to come in and be slave states. And the northern didn't want this, and eventually slavery became the issue. We fought our Civil War. And from 1861 to 1865, we fought this war. In January of 1865, just a few months before the war was over, there was an amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery in the entire country, proposed by Congress. As a matter of fact, December 18th, 1865, it was ratified. It was the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in our nation. Immediately after the Civil War, blacks were free. Free. They were done with the sexual exploitation of black women by their owners. They were done being denied access to education. They were done the horrific practice of separation of families. You know about that? You're a married black man, and your owner could sell your wife and kids, and you had no recourse, and you would never, in many cases, see them again. You okay with that? Sound like a good policy? So all of a sudden they're free. One of the cool things from history is that Christian missionary societies and other groups from the north began to send teachers down south to start schools for black adults and children. Did you know that? And the schools were packed with all ages of African Americans who wanted the education. They wanted to be able to read and write. They were so hungry for this. What a great part of our tradition. And then the worst tragedy in American history, probably of all time for the African American community, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The man who had led the war, who had fought so hard for that independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, is assassinated in April, right before the end of the war. The war is pretty much over right before. He never even got to see the amendment passed. Now, it's a terrible tragedy for African Americans because of a lot of reasons, but one of the worst outcomes is who his vice president was. Now, this is great history trivia for any of you who know who Abraham Lincoln vice president was. Unfortunately, it was this awful human being, Andrew Johnson. First president impeached in our nation's history. because he was just that bad a human being. Unfortunately, he was from Tennessee. He was a slave owner. He was a racist. His party chose him to try and pacify the Southern vote. Not because they liked him, not because they thought he would be a good politician. Nobody anticipated that Lincoln would be assassinated. Unfortunately, he was. And immediately, he began to undo all of the good that was trying to be done during that time called the Reconstruction period. We were reconstructing our nation. It had been destroyed by civil war. He stripped blacks of the right to vote. He allowed free elections in the South by whites only. And guess what they did? They put all the Confederates who had been in charge before the war back in power. These new governments in the South began to pass laws called the Black Codes. Blacks were allowed to marry, they could own property, and have limited access to courts, but they could not testify against a white person, they couldn't serve on a jury, and they could not vote. And those who failed to sign yearly labor contracts could be arrested and hired out to white landowners. So in other words, it was right back into slavery with you, only now we're not going to pay you to do it. Did you know that there were laws that allowed judges to simply take black children to work for their former owners without consent of their parents? Did you know that? How did you feel, Mom or Dad, if all of a sudden your kids were taken from you and you had no recourse and they were forced to work as slaves? Can you imagine the horror of this? You think you're free. And then right back in because of Andrew Johnson and his horrible racism. One of the worst things I read that I did not know. You ever heard of the Homestead Act of 1862? I'd never heard of it. Land that had been declared bankrupt and the federal government owned in the South was given to African Americans so that they could have land. Because what are you going to do? We set you free. You don't have an education, you don't have a job, you don't have any skills, but many of them are great farmers. So they set them up on 40-acre plots of land that they either bought or rent or they just gave to them. Until that man, he came along and sent the army and evicted every single one of them from land that many of them had legally purchased and gave it back to their slave owners. I mean, just a horrific, I am telling you the smallest fraction of what they see. The smallest piece of what they see when they look back. So they have no lands, no jobs. They are, many of them, forced to work right back on the white-owned plantations that they just escaped from. They have no education. And the wages are too low to get ahead. And then all of a sudden what we do, we keep going as a nation. And in 1870, we pass the 15th Amendment. And we guarantee the right to vote for all races. And did you know that the Slavery Society disbanded? When this 15th Amendment was passed, the Slavery Society, which was predominantly Christian pastors, 2/3 of them were Christian ministers, thought the work was done. We've set them free with the Emancipation Proclamation. They all have the right to vote now. Because the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. And they disbanded the society because they thought they were done and they were dead wrong. Violence erupted in the post-war South. In the early year of the Reconstruction, blacks were assaulted and murdered for, among other things, refusing to give way to a white person on a city sidewalk. That's a good reason to kill a human being, don't you think? Using insolent language, which they defined anything as insolent. They would just kill them. For challenging year-end contract settlements or attempting to buy land. You know what happened. You know what secret society sprung up, right? All about intimidation and violence. They committed some of the most brutal acts in American history. And here's the real tragedy. At this time, the people in the North who had been driving so much of this positive change just slowly stopped caring. Because we thought we'd won the war, we've set them free, and they have the right to vote. And they stopped caring. Matter of fact, one of the saddest things is there was a point in American history where these people down south appealed to the president, President Grant at the time, to help. And he said, basically, we're tired, you're on your own. You know the old saying, all that's necessary for evil to thrive is for good people to do nothing. And that's what happened. And evil thrived. as people in the North just stopped caring. It led to the rise, you can see who were the redeemers. It led to the rise of the redeemers. White voters were eventually pardoned, allowed to vote again because of Johnson. They returned to their positions of power because of Johnson. And they did what they called redeeming the Southern governments. At the time, Lincoln was the party of the Republicans. Republican leaders were replaced with Southern Democrats who remained in power until the Civil Rights era. So the Democrats did not want that system changed. So don't get hung up on the Republican-Democrat thing. But this is just the reality of it. As they got in power, they used the KKK as their force to terrorize blacks and Republicans and anyone who would want to try and make a change to the system in the South. They undid the elements of the Reconstruction. Budgets for schools were cut, especially for black schools. As one of the plantation owners said, what I want are blacks who can make cotton and they don't need education to help them make cotton. So we're taking your education away. They passed new laws, this was unbelievable, that authorized the arrest of any person without employment. Well, guess who that was? Blacks. You didn't have a job, they could arrest you. Did you know that? Can you imagine if we were arresting unemployed people in America today? Can you imagine that? But they had a purpose to that. And by the way, they greatly increased the sentences too, for any crime, including, I'm not making this up, mischief. You went to prison if you're a black person and caught and convicted of mischief. Or, was the other, offensive gestures. That's a prison sentence if you're black in the South during the time of the Redeemers. Prison sentence. And then what they did, incredibly, because there was such a dearth, there was such an absence of workforce in the South, they then turned around, arrested them for no reason, kept them in prison, and then sold them out as slaves. Did you know about this? They made them work. Companies lined up in the South to buy the black prisoners. And they paid these wealthy white prison owners to build railroads, mines, lumber companies, to compete for this new form of cheap involuntary labor, and conditions were barbaric. Disease and death. Can you imagine being arrested for mischief and you spend the rest of your life in prison working for a white man for no pay as they starve you to death and then you die in prison for mischief? This is the world they lived in. This is some of what was done to them. And then again, sadly, and I never knew this, then their voting rights were removed again. They started things called poll taxes, which they knew the blacks couldn't pay. So okay, you have the right, but you have to pay a tax, which we know you can't afford, so now you can't vote again. So they took their voting rights away again. They had literacy tests. How are you going to pass literacy tests when we've taken all your schools away? They created a system to keep themselves in power and to keep African Americans under their heel. As a matter of fact, as late as 1940, only 3% of black Southerners were even registered to vote. 1940, 3%. Their rights had been so stripped, and the North was silent. And you all have at some point have heard about the Jim Crow laws, which was legalized segregation. You know about this. They started new laws to keep blacks away from whites in every area. They applied it to schools, hospitals, waiting rooms, toilets, and cemeteries, and the Supreme Court said they're legal as long as they're equal. So, here's a school at the time. You tell me if that's separate and equal. And I want you intellectually, honestly, to answer the question, separate but equal? You know from our history, there was nothing equal about it, was there? Not a thing. It was horrible, horrible situations for these people. Do you know that in 1900, there was not a single public high school for blacks in the entire South? Not one. Sound like separate but equal to you? Matter of fact, the one historian said racial separation was segregation was more than just about separating black from white. It was more than that. He said, it was part of an all-encompassing system of white domination in which every component, unequal economic status, inferior education, reinforced the other part of it, so that whites always had the upper hand, and anyone who dared to speak out against it in the South faced the horror of lynchings. I can't show you pictures of this. I can only tell you that in the middle are two men, black men, who've been lynched in this picture. I can't show you the horrors of lynchings. But look at the people around them. You see the smiles? They just slaughtered two black people, almost guaranteed to have been innocent. Almost guaranteed. They just made this up. Matter of fact, if you ever want, from 1877 to 1950, there were 4,400 documented racial terror lynchings of black people. The entire city of Dodgeville wiped out because of your skin color. And those are just the documented ones. And that doesn't include the abuse and the threats and the intimidation and the violence that didn't kill them. But you can go to Montgomery, Alabama, and there's a museum called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and you can read the stories of people who were lynched, like Pastor T.A. Allen in Hernando, Mississippi, whose crime that got him killed was in 1935. He organized a bunch of sharecroppers. And they killed him. And nobody went to jail for that. I mean, you just killed a black man, so what does it matter? Oliver Moore was lynched in North Carolina in 1930 for frightening a white girl. Nathan Bird was lynched in Luling, Texas in 1902 for refusing to turn his son over to a mob. I'll tell you what, that would have been me. If I was black and you came for my son, you'd have to kill me first to get my son, right? How many of you dads wouldn't say the same, right? It's like, no way you're getting my son, and that's what they killed him for. And why was this allowed, this horrific system of abuse allowed? The history book said, even as white northern Protestants abandoned their concern for racial justice and embraced the idea of just sectional reconciliation, the Southern church played a key role in keeping the values of the Old South alive, to our shame. In both North and South, the school history textbooks of the day emphasized happy slaves. So we lied to ourselves. And our apathy allowed us to stand back and allow these tremendous injustices to take place, where innocent people were just slaughtered at the whims of white people simply because of race. And they had no justice, and they had no recourse. This is what happened. This is what they see. You want to see the worst race riot in history, you have to go back and look at the history of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. This is a picture of what part of the city looked like when more than 300 black people were killed and over 10,000 left homeless. You know why? A white mob, including the police and the National Guard, because they had all the power, burned an all-black section of the city to the ground, killed all those people. And do you know why? A group of black veterans tried to prevent the lynching of a young boy who accidentally tripped and fell on a white female elevator operator, causing rumors of rape to sweep the city. So they tried to save an innocent black boy, and in response they killed 300 of them and burned their section of the city to the ground, leaving 10,000 people homeless with no future and no recourse and no justice. Do you see what they see when they look? We don't see this. It's not that it wasn't in our history books. We just aren't looking. Finally, in 1956, the Jim Crow laws were ended, struck down by the Supreme Court and ruled unconstitutional. Incredibly. First off, I couldn't believe that was 1956. That doesn't feel like that long ago that they finally struck these stupid things down. And you know how they responded? I can't believe I'm about to tell you this. This is how they responded. With signing the Southern Manifesto, citizens and officials defied the orders, and 101 politicians in Congress, 99 Democrats, 2 Republicans, issued a document called the Southern Manifesto opposing the findings of that Supreme Court decision, the Brown decision. This is incredible to me. Almost every single politician from the South signed this thing. Almost all of them. And what it was an agreement was, we will continue to practice the Jim Crow laws and get away with it, and we'll just do it off the books. It's no longer on our laws. We'll just continue to enforce it. It was unbelievable. I can't believe this, because this wasn't that long ago at all. In Virginia, they pioneered the strategy of closing public schools rather than integrate them. They just shut them down. And then they gave vouchers to white parents so that their white kids to go to new segregated schools, and nothing to the blacks. They simply took all the educational opportunities away. In one county in Virginia, they shut their schools entirely from 1959 to 1964, 5 years, until the Supreme Court made them open up again. I had no clue about any of this. As a symbol of defiance, this just bothers me so bad. As a symbol of defiance in Georgia, their legislature incorporated the Confederate battle flag into its state flag in 1956. And they did it because they couldn't oppress black people legally anymore. So if we can't oppress you like we've been, we're going to put in our flag and rub your nose in it every single day from here on out. Isn't that incredible? Aren't you just horrified at this? And I'm telling you so little of what actually has happened to them. It's incredible. In Alabama and South Carolina, they began to fly the Confederate flag over all their state buildings in response to the Jim Crow laws being defeated. It's like, you may stop us legally, but you can't stop us. Take a look at this. This is called the Oak Park Pool in Montgomery, Alabama. It was built by public tax dollars in the 1930s and 40s. And obviously, if you're in Alabama in the summertime, it's hot, right? It's hot. So a public pool like this was super popular. As you can tell, it was beautiful, right? It was a meeting place for the town, completely funded by tax dollars and the citizens, but white-only pool because of segregation in Montgomery, Alabama. It was white-only. When the federal court said it is unconstitutional to segregate, to keep blacks out of a publicly funded white pool, the city council immediately drained the pool and shut it down, rather than let a black person swim in it. That happened all across the country, and not just in the South. All across the country, public parks and schools and pools were closed in response to the desegregation order. They just shut them down. And it happened all throughout the 1960s. In Montgomery, Alabama, in the 1960s, they shut down the public parks department for a decade. For 10 years, no public parks, rather than let a black person be in a public park. They just shut them down. They closed the rec centers. They actually sold the animals in the zoo rather than have a black person go to the zoo. They never rebuilt the pool. And here's what you need to understand, if you get nothing else out of what I'm saying today: racism costs all of us. Racism has a price for every single skin color in the country. You may not see the price, you may not think you're paying a price, we're paying a price. Racism always costs us all. And some of you, and believe me, I've heard so much of the other side of this. I did my research. And what you'll hear on the other side is, that's just the past. Well, let's take a look at the present then. Take a look at this slide. Now, this has Hispanics in this as well in this slide. Blacks and Hispanics in terms of wealth building. The average white household has approximately $134,000 in wealth. So they're counting all that you own, everything. Your possessions, the equity in your home, your savings account, everything. Everything. Look at what the average African-American family in America has today. Not even a tenth of what we own in terms of real wealth. Now, real wealth is what you use to put your kids through college. It's what you use to pay for the life that we have, and they don't have it. 1/10 of the wealth. Does this seem fair? It's not all in the past. As one author said, the number one source of intergenerational wealth in America is, do you guys know this? Number one source of intergenerational wealth in America is home ownership. Number one. I bought my house 3 years ago. I already have over $20,000 in equity in it. 3 years. That's all it takes. And I live in Dodgeville, right? And I don't live in a nice house. I mean, I'm remodeling an old house, which obviously is going to add a lot more value to it quicker, but I have $20,000. If I sold that thing next week, I cash out with 20 grand. And I can put in another house, a nicer house, and I can just keep doing that. The number one source of intergenerational wealth in America is home ownership. From the 1930s to the 1960s, the federal government. The federal government now. We're not talking about racist people in the South. Now we're talking about the federal government. Did everything they could to encourage whites to own homes and prevent blacks from owning them. In 1934, the FHA started a policy called redlining. If you listen to race discussions right now, you will hear the phrase redlining. Do you know what this means? They had home loans. The federal government wanted to make loans to people, but only if you were the right skin color. And so what they would do is they would rate the area that you lived in by risk factors. So if you were black, you see all the red areas there? That's where the black communities lived. So they redlined your area, which meant you, if you lived in one of the red areas, you didn't get a home loan. You were too risky. Didn't matter how much you made. So they wouldn't even give you a loan to buy a house. And it's the #1 wealth generator in America. So you don't get to own a house. You can live in these beautiful housing projects that we've created for you. Slums, where you don't get to build wealth. They took it away, and it was legal to do it. In 1948, and this is something you need to understand, it wasn't just happening in the federal government, it wasn't just happening in the South. In 1948, 40% of all the new houses built in Minneapolis contained covenants that prevented black people from owning houses in those neighborhoods. Did you know that? That's Minneapolis. If you're black, you can't even buy a house in our neighborhood. So you can't buy a house near us, you have to live in the slums, and on top of that, we're not even going to give you money, and now you live in that slum, we won't loan you money to buy a house even in the slum area where you live. This is what the federal government was doing. Some of you know your World War II history, you know about the GI Bill, you know about this? Soldiers coming back from the war, they had opportunities for houses and job training and things like that. Oh, except for the 1 million blacks who came back from World War II. They didn't have the same access because of the color of their skin. In New York and New Jersey, you know, guaranteed loans, right? And look at the skin color of the people who are going to get these loans, because that's exactly right. In New York and New Jersey, 67,000 new mortgages were given to veterans. Less than 100 went to African Americans. You want to see something worse? Look at Mississippi in 1947, 3,200 new mortgages, 2 went to blacks, 2. So you don't get even what you've earned by putting your life on the line to fight the Nazis. You don't get that. You can just live in these housing projects that we've built for you. One historian said there was no greater instrument for widening the racial gap financially in post-war America than the GI Bill, because of how it was implemented in a racist way. Because of your race, you can't even have what you've earned. What we promised you, you don't get because you're black. The consequences of this, of course, were devastating. You can't live by us. We won't let you buy a house in our neighborhood. There are no loans available for you, and you can't even live out in the suburbs. And until 1950, did you know there was the Realtor Code of Ethics in the 1950s said you could lose your license if you helped a black family buy a home in a white neighborhood. How'd you like to lose your job? By simply trying to help them. This is our reality. So by 1990, so this is a distant problem, right? 1990, 90% of all suburban whites lived in communities with non-white populations of less than 1%. Blacks couldn't afford it, they couldn't get in there, they didn't have the wealth opportunity, so we live in predominantly white neighborhoods. White suburbia, you ever heard that phrase? It's because it's real. We stopped them from getting loans, we stopped them, we took away their opportunity to earn wealth, and then We've stopped their education. I mean, it's just so many factors involved in this. In the 1970s, as you probably remember, in the 1970s, jobs started moving out of the inner city out to the suburbs. Factories moved out there, employers moved out there. Oh, guess who can't live out there? In the 1970s, only 28% of black fathers even had access to a car. So look at what happened when the jobs left their area. 70% of all black men in 1970 had good blue-collar jobs, 70%. Look what happened after the jobs left the area. 28%. Only 28% had access to good jobs now. And what do you think happens then? What's the outcome of that? You have no job. You have no education. We prevented you from having that. You've had no wealth building tool because we haven't loaned you the money or even let you live in the areas where the wealth would be. We've taken away everything from you. Unemployment skyrocketed in the inner city. And what happens when people have no hope and you've taken everything away from them and blocked them from even having access to it? Well, drugs, crime, Violence erupted. And so then we put in place a very serious system of punishing criminals after having created the environment where criminality was the natural consequence. Does that make sense? It doesn't defer their choices. It doesn't say they're not responsible, but we took away so many opportunities from them. No GI Bill, no mortgages, no homes in white neighborhoods, no homes for you, period. No schools, no school funding, no college degrees, and the jobs are gone. So can you understand why they're angry? Does it start to make a little more sense? And again, I know the other side, they're like, but now we've changed it all. We've fixed it. Realtors can sell to black people, right? You would get in trouble today if you did this. We've changed it. I got it. But look at what they're dealing with today. Look at what they're dealing with today. And despite all, on top of all the consequences from generations of this, their wealth is gone. But then look at what they're dealing with today. If you want to watch something fascinating, go on to TED Talk. There's some great ones on TED Talk, and look up this one. And I'll try to remember to post this to the video on our website so you can see these, so you don't have to try and remember this. This guy is hilarious. And if you know TED Talks, they're short, 15 to 20 minutes. He is amazing. He's a black man in America talking about racism that still exists. Because again, I think white people are really pretty insulated to this. We just don't think about it unless you hear someone make a directly racist comment. You just don't think about it. Go watch his. He collects headlines from around the country, and only from 2018 on. So this is happening now. Look at the headlines. White woman calls cops on black woman waiting for an Uber. Good reason to call the cops, right? White woman calls police on 8-year-old black girl selling water. Cops really needed to have that phone call, didn't they? White man calls police on black woman using neighborhood pool. Woman calls cops on black Oregon lawmaker campaigning in her district. White woman calls police on black real estate investor inspecting his own property. It's a black man in a construction project. He must be a criminal. On and on and on. California Safeway calls cops on black woman donating food to the homeless. His website, if you go watch his TED Talk, you'll see his website. He has hundreds of articles from 2018 for people for blacks having, the cops called them because they were napping, sitting in a Starbucks, walking, and recently, how many of you saw this incident with this poor guy in New York in a park, just wants to watch birds. Did you see this video? He's a bird watcher in New York. And a white woman comes in walking her dog, and it's not on a leash. And he politely asks her to put her dog on a leash, and she flips out in one of the most racist, awful things. If you've not watched this video, go watch the video. And makes a threatening phone call to the police, who come, and thank God he had his phone. What if he doesn't have his phone and can't record that? Who do they believe? And he records what she does in an unbelievable scene of modern-day racism in New York City, and it's still all around them. They can't escape it. And like he points out in the video, if you watch the video, you're going to laugh and you're going to learn a lot. He said, nothing's going to change until the action changes. He said, the headline should say, white woman buys all the inventory from the 8-year-old girl selling water in her neighborhood. That's what it should say. He said, the headline should say, white woman ignores black real estate investor who's inspecting his own property. Right? That's what the headline should say. But since whites call the cops so much on because of this inherent racial bias, which again, I don't even have time to talk to you about. I'll send you the video, you can watch it yourself. We know the bias is present. I don't have time, and one of the saddest things to talk about is the condition of African Americans in prison. Black Americans are more likely to serve longer sentences than white Americans for the exact same offense. White guy, black guy, both commit the same crime, their sentence is longer, and there are lots of factors for that. Black Americans are more likely to be arrested for drug use. Did you know that? Police arrest black Americans for drug crimes at twice the rate of whites, according to federal data, despite the fact that whites use drugs at the same level. But we arrest them twice as much, and whites sell drugs at a comparable or higher level. But who do we arrest? There's bias in the system. But the thing that gets me the most emotional is this. The thing that really bothers me is what's happened in the world of education for this this race from the beginning of their time in America. This is what really bothers me. If we're going to turn this around, you know that we're going to have to address the issue of education. Because if you don't know anything, you better know this. And I'll explain this chart. So the blue is your level of education. The higher your education, the blue is showing how likely you are to be unemployed. So if you have a doctoral degree in America, 98.9% of all people with a doctoral degree have a job. The higher your education level, the less likely it is that you are ever going to be unemployed in America. Does that make sense? The green side is your income level. What happens as your education level goes up in America? Your income level goes up, right? Makes sense. And it is substantial. The higher your education, the higher your income. Does everybody gets that, right? Makes sense. It makes sense. So how is our educational system in America funded today? Tax dollars based on revenue from real estate. For instance, if you've driven by the high school in Dodgeville recently, we're getting this massive multi-million-dollar addition to the high school. I am a property owner in Dodgeville. My taxes went up to pay for the education, right? That's how it works in America. What happens if you're born here? What happens if you're born in inner city Baltimore? How much do you think that property is worth? The consequences of the way that we do funding for public education is we have created a system where this exists today. High poverty districts serving mostly students of color receive about $1,600 less per student per year than the national average. They're not even at the national average. They're that far below it. So you know what the consequences of that are? Underfunded inner city schools. Why do they live in the city? We put them there because we wouldn't loan them anything. We wouldn't give them mortgages. We wouldn't even let them live in our neighborhoods in Minneapolis. Not Alabama. We trapped them in the inner city in public housing, took their jobs and moved them out, didn't give them transportation to get there. And then we gave them the crappiest schools in the history of our country in inner city because there's no funding. Have you seen, if you want to do this, Google it. Go Google inner city Milwaukee teachers sleeping in class. Go watch those videos. Because when you have no money for your schools, you get the crappiest teachers. Sorry, I'm not being controversial. There are good teachers and there are terrible teachers. Guess where the terrible teachers get hired? Guess where they go to get jobs? They're going to get hired. You think they're going to get hired in Maple Bluff where the governor lives? No, not going to get hired there. They're going to get hired in the only place they can get jobs in the terrible school districts where they just have to hire somebody. And the facilities are garbage, and the textbooks are garbage, and they are given nothing they need to succeed. And what creates wealth for these kids? Education. And we've stripped it from them in such an amazing way. Just Google it. School districts serving students of color have less money. You will be overwhelmed by the number of articles you read. This is their reality. And it is so awful. I'm telling you, I did not know. Students of color are often concentrated in schools with fewer resources. Schools with 90% or more students of color spend $733 less per student per year than schools with 90% or more white students. Again, over and over again, I could just overwhelm you with statistics about the fact they get less money. And here's the consequences. African American students are less likely than white students to have access to college-ready courses. In 2011 and 12, okay, not that long ago, only 57% of black students had access to a full range of math and science courses necessary for college readiness. We're not even offering them the classes that they're going to need to take the next step educationally. They don't even get a shot at it. No shot in America today. If you saw that picture of separate but equal and the blacks in that awful school with a big pot, stove in the middle trying to heat them with horrible textbooks and nothing else, you would be upset if that was still happening today. It's happening today. It is happening today. It is not separate but equal because of the way we fund it. 61% then of ACT-tested black students in the 2015 class met none of the 4 ACT class readiness benchmarks. Well, how can they? We don't even offer them the classes that they need to pass the ACT test. Look at this, 25% of high schools with the highest percentage of black and Latino students don't even offer Algebra 2. 25%, and a third don't offer chemistry. How are you going to pass the ACT section on chemistry when you attended black inner city school and we don't even offer the class? Are you getting why they're mad? Do you start to see the system is gamed against them? It's been gamed against them for 300 years, and we stopped caring a long, long time ago. I stopped caring a long time ago. So they have a totally different perspective. And we say, well, just go get a better job and go to school. What school? They have no shot. They can't even take the classes that'll get them into college. We don't even offer it in their schools because they're inner city. Are you okay with that? In 2000, okay, not that long ago, the ACLU had to file a lawsuit in Southern California against a school system on behalf of 100 students that attend Luther Burbank Middle School in San Francisco in the year 2000. Listen to this. In the year 2000, these kids were going to an inner city school because they're predominantly minority students with the textbooks that were so scarce, kids couldn't even take them home. They didn't have enough for all the kids. On top of that, they were so old, they didn't recognize that the collapse of the Soviet Union had already happened. That happened like what, 30 years ago? That's how out of date their textbooks are. And because of how run down the facilities are, for certain parts of the day, there are no bathrooms. How can that be? Could you imagine if they shut down the public restrooms in the Dodgeville Middle School for 6 hours a day because the plumbing was so inadequate they couldn't do it? Can you imagine what we would do? And this is their reality. What options do the poor have in America? They take it until, thankfully, the ACLU stepped in and sued them. These kids, these middle school kids, at times had to urinate or defecate on themselves. The school was full of rats. You okay with that? That sounds like a good environment for minority children? Year after year, they have to deal with poor teachers, poor curriculum, poor facilities, and no opportunity to even take the classes that will give them an education that will get them out of poverty. And so let me go back to this verse. The righteous care about justice for the poor. So are you righteous or are you wicked? Do you care at all? Does this bother you on any level? So I know that following Jesus means I have to care about justice issues. I have to care about the plight of the oppressed. I have to care about the plight of the poor. This is what it means. Because we're really just talking about these kids. We're talking about kids who are growing up in America with no shot because of their zip code. Because of what we have done for hundreds of years to them. So are you okay with where we're at as a nation? Does this start to make a little more sense now? Totally different perspective, isn't it? Totally different perspective. They don't see this. They see all of this, and they're mad. And you know what? They have the right to be mad. We should be mad. We should be mad. Because it's happening in our country. And racism affects us all. It affects every single one of us. Because we only win when the person who's losing the most starts to win too. Because that's when we win as a nation. Because some of these kids that have no shot at an education, some of them were going to cure cancer if they'd have been white and in the right school district. Some of them were going to be the next Abraham Lincoln if they'd have been white, and they would have changed our nation's discussions. Some of them would have been amazing men or women of God who led churches that led communities to Christ if they wouldn't have been born where they were born with the skin color they had. We all lose because of racism. And in case you haven't caught my value on this, racism, according to the Bible, is evil. It is injustice. It needs to be confronted by passive white people like me. And oh, by the way, Jesus wasn't white. That looks nothing like Jesus. Nothing. He wasn't tan. He didn't have blue eyes. He didn't have brown hair. He was Middle Eastern. He looked nothing like us. Nothing like us. and he still loved us no matter what. So here's all I'm hoping for. All I'm hoping for today is that you acknowledge there's a problem. Would you do that? Did I make the case that there's a problem? That these people have a valid reason to be upset and hurt and angry and mad? Do you get that now? Are you okay living in a country where an 8-year-old girl gets the cops called on her because she's selling water in a white neighborhood? That okay with you? Not okay with me. Buy all her water and shut up. Put your phone down. Don't call the cops. They don't need to have the cops called. God's view of racism is that it is evil, it is injustice, it needs to be confronted. And we need to acknowledge there is a problem. And I'm telling you right now, okay, here's my controversial part, all right? It's bigger than people kneeling during the national anthem. Okay, so now I know I'm stepping on some people's toes. But you have two issues that Colin Kaepernick was trying to bring to attention. The systemic, awful racism that exists in America, or people kneeling during the national anthem. Which one's the worst problem? Do you get why he was doing it now? Do you understand? It may make you furious that he did it. But does this make you more angry? This should make you more angry. The kids today in America have no shot because of the systems we've created. That should make you mad. That should make you mad. That a poor African-American guy just wants to look at birds in New York City and has the cops called on him and if not recording it, would have probably gone to jail. That should make you mad. That this is our country. We need to have much more compassion and empathy for people who have suffered like this for 300 years, and we should care about injustice. And the solutions, I have none. No idea. I know if I could wave a magic wand tomorrow and change one thing, I'd change the educational system. That's what I would change. If I could wave a magic wand, here's what I would do. If I were president for one day, here's what I'd do. I would reverse the public education funding system. So in Chicago, in the wealthiest neighborhoods where the superstars live and they've got millions and millions of dollars and they fund their schools, you should read how some of these high wealth schools in Chicago, what they have for their kids. I mean, it's like gold water fountains to drink from, but not really. But that's the idea. I mean, they have everything. So what I would do is in Chicago, the poorest neighborhood gets all the funding from the richest neighborhood, and the richest neighborhood gets all the funding from the poorest neighborhood. So that you create schools that are paradise for these poor kids who have been stuck in these ghettos for so long. They go to school and it's amazing, and they got counselors and they got food and they got nutrition and they get the best teachers making $90,000 a year, because that's what they make in the rich area. And they are highly motivated, and those kids get access to every single class, because you know what the rich people will do? They'll just pay for it on their own, right? That's my one solve. If I was a genie for the day, I'd flick my wrist and that would be different. And I'm not. And I don't know the answer going forward. I don't know, but I felt like I couldn't stay silent any longer. 29 years was enough. And I'm mad at myself for living in a world where this all happened and I didn't say anything earlier. It's not okay. It was not okay for me to be content to blame the victims who have been victimized for 300 years. I shouldn't have done that, and I was wrong. Like I said, very different kind of message, and I'm done. Sorry, way long. Let me have you bow your heads. Let's pray. God, there's no way that we can even begin to imagine the horror and the pain and the suffering that they have suffered, and that this race is suffering today when they look at their future and they see nothing but crime in their future, or violence, or drugs, or abuse in their future. And we have, as your followers, not been involved. Forgive us, forgive us, forgive us. I don't know what we're supposed to do from this, but I know that we're supposed to care. Would you at least let us walk out of here caring about this from this day forward? Would you at least let us do that? I pray that you would show us what we're supposed to do to be involved in a justice issue this big. How can we help? And I pray that you would intervene in some way, so that at least they know we've heard their pain and we've heard their cry. Just give this situation to you in Jesus' name. Amen.